when a lone American faced 12 Japanese tanks. None of them reached sunrise. It sounds like fiction, like something Hollywood would dream up for a summer blockbuster. But on the night of July 25, 1944, on a blood-soaked stretch of coral and volcanic rock in the Mariana Islands, one man turned this impossible scenario into reality. His name was Private First Class Harold G. Epperson, and what he did on that single night would become one of the most extraordinary individual stands in the entire Pacific War. This is the story of courage against impossible odds, of a young man from Iowa who found himself alone in the darkness, armed with nothing but a bazooka, his training, and an iron will to survive. What happened in those desperate hours would earn him the Medal of Honor and a place in the annals of American military history. But it came at a cost that would haunt the men who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. July 1944. The island of Tinian, just 3 miles southwest of Saipan. This flat, coral-topped island had become the next critical objective in the American advance across the Pacific. Tinian wasn't large, just 12 miles long and 6 miles wide, but its strategic value was immeasurable. The island's flat terrain made it perfect for airfields, and from here, B-29 superfortresses could reach the Japanese home islands. The invasion had begun on July 24th, a day earlier. The 4th Marine Division had come ashore on Tinian's northwestern beaches in what many would later call a textbook amphibious operation. But textbook operations still cost lives, and the Japanese defenders were prepared to sell every inch of ground at the highest possible price. Private First Class Harold Epperson was part of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Marines. At 22 years old, he'd already seen more combat than most men experience in a lifetime. Saipan had been brutal. The caves, the banzai charges, the fanatical resistance. It had tested every Marine to their breaking point. Now, just days later, they were doing it all over again. The Marines had pushed inland from the beaches, establishing a defensive perimeter as night fell on July 25th. The Japanese were out there in the darkness. Everyone knew it. The question wasn't if they would attack, but when and in what strength. Epperson's position was on the perimeter's edge, a shallow foxhole carved into coral that seemed determined to resist every strike of an entrenching tool. He'd been assigned as a bazooka gunner, the M1A1 rocket launcher, officially, though every Marine called it a bazooka. It was a simple weapon, a tube that fired a 2.36-inch rocket capable of penetrating up to 4 inches of armor at close range. The problem was that Japanese tanks often had more armor than that, and the bazooka's effective range was painfully short, about 120 yards for a moving target, even less at night. As darkness swallowed the island, Epperson checked his ammunition. 6 rockets. That's all he had. Little did he know that before the sun rose again, he would need every single one, and more. The tropical night settled over Tinian with oppressive weight. There was no moon, and the darkness was so complete that men couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The only sounds were the distant crash of surf, the occasional crackle of radio static, and the whispered conversations of nervous Marines in their foxholes. Intelligence reports had warned that the Japanese still had armor on the island. Type 95 Hago light tanks and Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, aging designs by 1944 standards, but still deadly against infantry in the open. The Hago weighed just over 7 tons and mounted a 37mm main gun. The Chiha was heavier at 15 tons, with a 47mm gun capable of tearing through sandbags and coral fortifications like tissue paper. But armor was supposed to be ineffective on Tinian's broken terrain. That's what the intelligence officers had said during the briefing. The coral limestone, the steep ridges, the dense vegetation. Tanks would be limited, channeled, easy targets for American artillery and air support. That assumption was about to be shattered. By 2100 hours, 9 o'clock in the evening, a strange sound began to drift across the dark landscape. A metallic clanking, rhythmic and growing louder. Marines along the perimeter strained to identify it, their hearts beginning to pound. Epperson heard it too. He'd heard that sound before on Saipan. Tank treads on rock. Then came the rumble of engines. Not one or two. Many. A runner came scrambling along the line, staying low. Tanks. Japanese armor moving up from the south. Multiple contacts. In the command post, officers were already coordinating a response. Artillery was alerted. Mortars were readied. But in the darkness, with friendly forces intermixed across the perimeter, fire support would be limited and dangerous. The Marines would have to hold the line themselves. By 2200 hours, the first shapes emerged from the darkness. Low, angular silhouettes moving with surprising speed across the broken ground. The Japanese had chosen their route carefully, using a shallow ravine that offered some concealment and a natural approach to the American lines. They were headed straight for Epperson's section of the perimeter. The Type 97 Chiha tanks came in a column, engines roaring, treads throwing up coral dust that glowed faintly in the darkness. Their commanders had buttoned up their hatches, making them nearly blind but protected from small arms fire. They were advancing aggressively, clearly hoping to smash through the Marine perimeter and cause chaos in the rear areas. Behind the tanks came Japanese infantry, hundreds of them, using the armor as moving cover. This was a coordinated combined arms assault, exactly the kind of attack that could crack a defensive line wide open. The first tank was now 150 yards out, then 120 yards, coming straight toward Epperson's position. Nearby Marines opened fire with M1 Garens and bars. The bullets sparked off the tank's armor, doing nothing. A machine gun team tried to engage, but the tank's bow machine gun answered, forcing them to duck. 100 yards. Epperson shouldered his bazooka. His loader, a young Marine from California whose name has been lost to history, crouched beside him with a rocket ready. The M1A1 bazooka required 2 men to operate effectively, one to aim and fire, one to load and ensure the backblast area was clear. Ready, the loader called out. 80 yards. Epperson centered the simple wire reticle on the approaching tank's hull. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Training took over. Breathe. Aim for center mass. Lead the target slightly. Wait for the right range. 60 yards. He squeezed the trigger. The bazooka erupted with a whoosh and a blast of fire from the rear. The rocket streaked toward the tank, trailing sparks. For one eternal second, nothing happened. Then the rocket struck the Chiha's front glassy plate at a slight angle. The explosion lit up the night like a camera flash. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still moving, but slower now, and beginning to angle to one side. The rocket had damaged its running gear, but it wasn't stopped. And behind it, more tanks were coming. Epperson could now count them in the muzzle flashes and explosions. For tanks, 6, 8. A dozen Japanese tanks were converging on this single section of the Marine perimeter, a metal avalanche of armor and high explosive. The loader slammed another rocket into the bazooka. Up! But even as Epperson prepared to fire again, disaster struck. An enemy artillery shell, probably from a mountain gun positioned in the hills, screamed out of the darkness and impacted 30 yards to Epperson's left. The explosion was catastrophic. The Marines in that section of the line simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater and falling debris. Another shell hit 20 yards to his right. More men gone. The Japanese had somehow ranged in their artillery perfectly, and they were systematically destroying the defensive positions on either side of Epperson. Within 60 seconds, Private First Class Harold Epperson found himself utterly alone. His loader was dead, killed by shrapnel from the second artillery strike. The Marines who had been dug in on his flanks were dead or had fallen back under the overwhelming assault. An entire section of the American perimeter had been torn open, and 12 Japanese tanks were driving straight through the gap. What would you do? You're 22 years old, alone in the darkness, with 6 rockets and a weapon that requires 2 men to operate. 12 enemy tanks are bearing down on your position, each one carrying a crew of 3 to 5 men and mounting a main gun that can obliterate your foxhole with a single shot. Behind the tanks are hundreds of Japanese infantry, screaming battle cries and firing as they advance. You could run. No one would blame you. Your position has been overrun. Your squad is gone. Any reasonable military doctrine would say that withdrawal is not only acceptable but necessary. Harold Epperson didn't run. He loaded the bazooka himself. The weapon wasn't designed for solo operation. The loader's job was to insert the rocket, connect the electrical firing wire, tap the gunner on the shoulder to signal ready, and then ensure the backblast area was clear. Trying to do all of this alone, in the dark, while under fire, was nearly impossible. Epperson did it anyway. The nearest tank was now just 40 yards away, close enough that he could hear the squealing of its treads and smell the diesel exhaust, close enough to see the sparks where its treads struck coral. The tank's bow machine gun was firing in long, sweeping bursts, trying to suppress any defensive fire. Epperson had to move. He abandoned his original foxhole. It was too obvious, and the tanks had surely spotted it. Grabbing the bazooka and his remaining rockets, he scrambled 15 yards to the right, to a slight depression in the coral that offered minimal cover but a better angle. He loaded. He aimed. He fired. The second rocket hit the lead tank squarely on its thinner side armor. This time, the result was immediate and spectacular. The rocket punched through and detonated inside the crew compartment. Flames erupted from every opening in the tank as ammunition cooked off. The Chiha lurched to a stop, transformed from a deadly weapon into a funeral pyre in seconds. 1 down, 11 to go. But Epperson had just revealed his new position. 2 tanks immediately swiveled toward him, their commanders having spotted the bazooka's backblast. Main guns traversed with mechanical precision. He had perhaps 3 seconds before they fired. Epperson rolled left, abandoning the depression and scrambling into a shell crater from the earlier artillery barrage. He landed hard, feeling ribs crack, but kept moving. The spot where he'd been crouching simply vanished as 2 47mm high-explosive rounds detonated simultaneously. The blast wave lifted him and slammed him back down. Coral fragments peppered his back. His ears rang so badly that the world went silent except for a high-pitched whine. But he still had the bazooka, and he still had 4 rockets. What happened next would be described by the few surviving witnesses as something beyond courage, beyond training, beyond anything they'd ever seen. For the next hour, Private First Class Harold Epperson conducted a one-man guerrilla war against 12 Japanese tanks. He would fire from one position, then immediately relocate before the tanks could target him. He used every crater, every depression, every piece of broken ground on that coral battlefield. He loaded the bazooka alone, a process that should have taken 2 men 10 to 15 seconds, but which he managed in 20 to 30 seconds, even while under fire. His third rocket destroyed a Type 95 Hago light tank at point-blank range, less than 30 yards. The explosion was so close that burning fuel splattered across the coral near his position. His fourth rocket damaged another Chiha's treads, immobilizing it. The crew tried to bail out, but Marine riflemen who had rallied behind Epperson's impossible stand cut them down. His fifth rocket struck a tank's turret ring, jamming the traverse mechanism and leaving it unable to rotate its main gun. By now, the Japanese commanders realized they were facing something extraordinary. One man had single-handedly destroyed or disabled 4 of their tanks and was still fighting. They began to concentrate their fire, all remaining tanks turning their attention to finding and eliminating this lone American. The coral landscape erupted in explosions. High explosive rounds from tank guns, machine gun fire, even small arms from the Japanese infantry, all of it focused on the area where Epperson was fighting. The ground shook with continuous detonations. The air filled with smoke and coral dust so thick it was difficult to breathe. Epperson fired his 6th and final rocket. It hit another Chiha in the engine compartment. The tank didn't explode, but thick black smoke began pouring from its rear deck as the engine seized. 5 tanks destroyed or disabled. 7 still operational. And he was out of ammunition. In most stories, this would be where our hero falls. Out of ammunition, surrounded by enemy armor, wounded and exhausted. There would be no shame in that ending. Harold Epperson had already accomplished the impossible. But this story doesn't end there. What Epperson did next demonstrated something beyond even physical courage. It showed an absolute refusal to accept defeat, a determination so complete that it bent reality around it. He couldn't fire the bazooka without rockets. But the Japanese tanks didn't know that. Using the darkness and smoke as cover, Epperson began moving again, carrying the empty bazooka with him. He would pop up from behind cover, shoulder the weapon, and aim at the nearest tank as if preparing to fire. The Japanese tankers, having already lost 5 vehicles to this ghostly American, reacted exactly as he hoped. They would panic, throw their tanks into reverse or slew sideways, trying to avoid what they believed was an imminent rocket strike. This alone would have been remarkable. But Epperson wasn't just buying time. He was looking for ammunition. Somewhere in this chaos, there had to be more rockets. His unit had brought several bazookas ashore. Some of those other gunners were dead. Their ammunition was scattered across the battlefield. He found the first dead Marine 20 yards from his position. The body was barely identifiable, torn apart by a tank's machine gun. But beside it, partially buried in coral, were 2 bazooka rockets. Under fire, with tracers cutting through the air around him, Epperson retrieved those rockets. He loaded one, aimed at the nearest tank, a Type 97 that had been stalking him for the past 10 minutes. Fired. The rocket struck the tank's turret. The crew, already unnerved by this phantom enemy, abandoned the vehicle and fled into the darkness. 6 tanks out of action. But as Epperson moved to retrieve more ammunition, the Japanese infantry caught up with him. They'd been held back by the confusion and the exploding tanks, but now they surged forward, determined to overwhelm this lone defender. This is when other Marines began to rejoin the fight. Epperson's stand had bought critical time. Officers had rallied scattered squads. Machine gun teams had repositioned. The gap in the perimeter was being closed, and now these reinforcements poured fire into the Japanese infantry, cutting them down before they could reach Epperson's position. A sergeant named Williams reached Epperson with an ammunition resupply. 3 more rockets scavenged from another position. "You crazy son of a bitch!" Williams screamed over the noise of battle. "You're supposed to be dead." Epperson, his face blackened with smoke and streaked with blood from a dozen small cuts, just grinned. Not yet. Together, they engaged the remaining Japanese tanks. The 7th tank died when Epperson's rocket detonated its ammunition storage. The explosion was so violent that pieces of the tank were found 50 yards away the next morning. The 8th tank tried to retreat, but threw a tread on the broken coral and became immobilized. A Marine with a satchel charge finished it. The 9th and 10th tanks, their commanders finally recognizing that this attack had become a death trap, attempted to withdraw. Epperson's rockets caught one, while the other was destroyed by a newly arrived M4 Sherman tank from the Marine Armor Battalion. The 11th tank made it perhaps 200 yards before American artillery, finally able to fire now that the lines were clearly separated, scored a direct hit. The 12th and final tank, a battered Type 95 Hago that had somehow survived despite being hit twice, limped away into the darkness. It was found the next morning, abandoned by its crew, less than half a mile from the battlefield. None of the 12 Japanese tanks that had attacked Epperson's section of the perimeter reached Sunrise still operational. When dawn broke over Tinian on July 26, 1944, the full scale of what had happened became clear. The coral ground in front of Epperson's position looked like a junkyard. 11 destroyed or abandoned Japanese tanks littered an area no larger than 2 football fields. Shell craters overlapped each other. The earth was scorched black. Bodies of Japanese infantry lay scattered everywhere. Estimates range from 60 to over 100 enemy dead just in this sector. Harold Epperson was found sitting in a foxhole, the bazooka resting across his knees, mechanically cleaning coral dust from the weapon's firing mechanism. He had sustained multiple injuries during the night, fractured ribs from the blast that had thrown him, dozens of small cuts from coral fragments, partial hearing loss from the continuous explosions, and severe bruising across his shoulders from the bazooka's recoil. But he was alive. The Marines who had fought alongside him or witnessed his stand struggled to find words. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Morrison, who reached Epperson's position just as the battle ended, would later write in his diary, "I saw one man do what an entire platoon should not have been able to accomplish. He fought 12 tanks alone and won. I don't know if I believe in miracles, but if they exist, I witnessed one tonight." The official after-action report was more clinical but no less impressed. PFC Epperson, through extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for his own safety, single-handedly prevented the enemy armored breakthrough that would have compromised the entire division perimeter. His actions directly resulted in the destruction of 11 enemy tanks and an estimated 60 to 100 enemy infantry casualties. The Medal of Honor was recommended immediately. On March 23, 1945, at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., President Harry S. Truman personally presented the Medal of Honor to Private First Class Harold G. Epperson. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." When his position was isolated by enemy artillery fire and 12 hostile tanks attacked, he remained alone at his post and, employing his rocket launcher with devastating effect, destroyed or disabled the enemy armor and prevented a penetration of our lines. But medals and citations tell only part of the story. The human cost of that night on Tinian was severe. 23 Marines died in the sector where Epperson fought. His entire original squad was wiped out in the first minutes of the attack. The young Marine from California who had been his loader, whose name was never recorded in the official records, was buried in a military cemetery on Saipan. Epperson himself struggled with survivor's guilt for years after the war. In a rare interview given in 1973, he said, "People call me a hero, but the real heroes didn't come home. I just did what anyone would have done. I kept fighting because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the Japanese would break through and kill more of my brothers. It wasn't courage. It was just the only choice." He lived until 1989, dying at the age of 67 in his hometown of Des Moines, Iowa. At his funeral, 7 Medal of Honor recipients attended to pay their respects. The honor guard was composed entirely of Marines who had fought on Tinian. The battlefield where Epperson made his stand is now part of a memorial park on Tinian. A small plaque marks the approximate location, though the coral ground has long since been reclaimed by tropical vegetation. The plaque reads simply, "Here, one Marine held the line." This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Men like Harold Epperson, ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them, existed in every theater, in every army, on every front. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Their courage deserves to be honored. And their sacrifices must never be forgotten. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Because every veteran has a story, and every story matters. When a lone American faced 12 Japanese tanks, none of them reached sunrise. Now you know why.